Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum show, committed to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, Lorcan Price, an Irish barrister and legal counsel for ADF International, which is an advocacy group that fights on behalf of religious liberty, freedom of conscience, and also on behalf of the married family in policy making. Now, Lorcan, last time you came onto the New Culture Forum, you were being interviewed for Peter Whittle, our director's flagship show. Whittle talking about problems of free speech in Ireland in particular. Ireland and Britain seem to be engaged in a competition at the moment to see who can most effectively censor and muzzle their population. Who do you think is winning at the moment?
Well, I would say this country, Britain, just because it's better organised at crackdowns. But I think we need to just give Ireland a chance to catch up, because they're determined, the government in Ireland and the Irish elite are determined to catch up. I think, as I said to Peter, there's a feeling, at least among Irish policymakers, that Ireland's liberal moment has come. That we were trapped, as they would see it, in the kind of the grip of the Catholic Church for a long time. But now we've arrived into late stage liberalism. The party is on, and we're going to bring in everything we can as quickly as possible: censorship, abortion, gay marriage, euthanasia, probably in the coming times, comprehensive sexuality education. So all of the trappings of being a mature liberal country, the Irish elite, political elite, the media and their cheerleaders in the kind of NGO academic sector, they're determined to embrace all of that. And so that includes, of course, yes, using the power of the state to crack down on opinions that they regard as hateful.
And the hate speech bill, as I understand it, it's still sort of languishing in Parliament at the moment. It hasn't yet gone through.
Yes.
Have there been any developments, encouraging developments on that score, or indeed any negative developments?
Well, all we hear is a lot of criticism. Well, perhaps not a lot, but criticism certainly from senior backbenchers on the government side about the legislation. And it's still there, you're correct, they haven't withdrawn it, but the sense of urgency around it seems to ebb and flow depending on what's happening in response to the migration crisis. So if there is a situation where there's public disorder, as night follows day, you'll have an Irish minister trotting out saying, well, this is just another reason we need the hate speech law. So they then say that, and then nothing happens. So I haven't seen the legislative programme for the coming term yet. I'm not sure if it's published, but we'll have to wait and see if it's a priority piece of legislation when they publish their programme. But there may well be a general election in the autumn or the winter, so we could see a new government then. If that's the case, then the legislation will obviously be parked and may well be completely withdrawn until whatever new government comes in, and they may decide to pick it up.
You speak there about the migration crisis. For viewers in Britain who are not necessarily that clued up on Irish politics, what are you referring to there, and why is there a clampdown on that from the government in the first place? Particularly since the end of COVID, well, I'll go back a little bit further. When Ireland started to become economically successful in the mid to late 90s, we became a country that, instead of having heavy immigration numbers, we had migration numbers inward, or emigration rather. We had immigration for the first time, really since, well, let's say the first time in the modern era. And you're going to mention
I was going to mention James I. Yes, exactly. I was, and the Elizabethan plantation. But in fact,
very enriching.
Yes. Yeah. So for the first time in centuries, Ireland became a country that was receiving more people than it was sending abroad. And they came predominantly from the Middle East, North Africa, and Nigeria. And this was a major change in Ireland demographically. I remember for the first time seeing people who weren't ethnically European and white Irish when I was in my early teens on the streets of my hometown. And they were, I think it's fair to say, over the coming years, integrated into Irish society. There was very little political reaction from the right to this phenomenon. There was a small fringe organisation called the Immigration Control Platform, but there was no major organised contestation of this, with the exception of the fact that Irish immigration law was changed by the government in a referendum in 2003 to change the basis on which you could claim citizenship. And there was a very high turnout and a high vote in favour of changing Irish citizenship law, which I think was an indication that while Irish people were welcoming to people who'd come in, they wanted to retain control of that, and they wanted there to be clear delineations in law as to how citizenship was awarded, and they wanted to restrict the basis on which that could be done. Then there was an economic crash, as we all know, and what followed was a period of recovery. COVID hit, and the war in Ukraine. And the Irish government decided that it was going to have a very generous policy of welcoming Ukrainian refugees into the country, which the vast majority of Irish people supported. People opened their homes for refugees. There was a crisis in finding accommodation for them. Church groups and others were finding places for them to stay. But then the numbers didn't stop. They kept going, and it was clear to everybody watching that you weren't simply dealing with Ukrainian families, women and children fleeing the war. You had a lot of what are described as military-aged men from the Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa who were clearly not Ukrainian, and who were taking, in the view of a lot of people, advantage of the situation and exacerbating an existing accommodation crisis. Suddenly you had tents springing up in Dublin city centre. You had people being accommodated in hotels, overflowing into conference centres. The army started to put in kind of large tents in former barracks around the country to accommodate people. So the country had reached a kind of a max carrying capacity. And of course, there was a reaction to this politically. People became quite concerned, particularly with large numbers of kind of single men arriving into their communities. Small villages around the country were designated as migrant reception centres, so old hotels or youth hostels were being bought up by developers and then fitted out as migrant reception centres. And this was being done without consulting the community, asking people what they thought about this. And you have the absurd situation of small villages having their populations doubled overnight with people from all across the world. There's no vetting of who these people are, whether or not they've had criminal records. It became chaotic. And in response to that, people felt that their views weren't being heard. Politicians did not touch the issue. Most politicians from the mainstream political parties didn't touch the issue. It was regarded as toxic. The media, their approach to it was to simply wonder whether or not people's concerns was an example of the rise of the far right. So you're being ignored by the politicians, subtly called a racist by the media. And so people took to the streets and they expressed themselves in a kind of a robust way, which unfortunately in some places became violent. It was policed very badly by the police. The public order unit, the riot squad, were sent in to deal with predominantly communities who were concerned about who was going to be living amongst them. And this has all been drawn in then to this kind of hate speech context that the Irish government is determined to force through in law. And I think what I suppose was beamed around the world was the riot in Dublin city centre in the aftermath of the stabbing of 4 children in a place called Parnell Square in Dublin. That's unprecedented in Ireland. In Irish history, modern history, that you would have small children being stabbed outside of a school. Nothing like that happened in the Troubles, for example, in Northern Ireland. Now, it's quite common, sadly, in continental Europe because of some crimes associated with the people of a migrant background. And sure enough, this chap was, the guy who did the stabbing was from a migrant background. The media initially tried to cover that up. The community found out about it, and people took to the streets, and it got out of hand pretty quickly. And in response to that, the government, which had already introduced this legislation, then committed to pushing this hate speech law through. Because their view is, to put it crudely, if you can censor people's concerns about this online, then they won't be able to organise and galvanise themselves to react to it.
One encouraging thing that I found after Ireland was almost turned into the UK's Lampedusa was this street level and online uprising by patriotic Irishmen who were not content to see both their communities swamped with limitless numbers of hostile dependents, but also the political reaction in when they tried to both gaslight the public into not noticing the problem before their very eyes with the hate speech bill, but also when they tried to change the constitution around the same time to liquidate the role of the family and its importance in Irish politics. And half my family is Irish. Donegal, where they're from, was the sort of hotbed of rebellion in that regard. But you look to the other Celtic nations, and their Celtic nationalism is always coached in a kind of progressive minoritarian concern. I'm thinking, for example, of when they tried to deport some illegal immigrants out of Scotland, and the vans were swarmed by local activists, and then head of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, took to Twitter to say, how could you do this in the holy month of Eid, despite the men in question being Sikh? And the mob won out. Those men were not deported, they were released from the van. What is it about Ireland where they retain a particular consciousness of themselves as a nation, as a people, and they refuse to be dispirited in a way that the British and the Scottish and the Welsh seem to be?
Well, I'll take the deportation element of that first. We don't know how Irish people would respond to deportations. It's never been tried. We deport virtually nobody. So the figures are extraordinary, and the Irish Minister for Justice was questioned on this before a parliamentary committee. So you have tens of thousands of applicants annually, and I think last year less than 100 applicants whose applications were rejected were deported. So it's extraordinary. In other words, you can be confident as a failed applicant that you will be allowed to remain de facto. And then you will hope eventually that at a certain point, you either by way of judicial review or otherwise be given leave to remain indefinitely, and then you can simply stay in the country. So there's a ratcheting effect. The numbers just keep going up and virtually nobody is deported. So I don't know whether that's just classic incompetence at a bureaucratic level, or if it's worse than that, it's a deliberate policy of not enforcing the law. But to your other point about where this activism comes from, there are two elements to it, I think. One is that Ireland is still a high trust society. Particularly outside of Dublin, there's a homogenous population that has deep roots into the locality. I'm thinking of my own relatives in County Monaghan, who have been essentially in the same kind of parish lands for hundreds of years. And that's quite common in Ireland. There's only one large city really, and that's Dublin, and that has a relatively transient population. But outside of Dublin, there's strong, thick, high social trust communities, and finding then Ireland is well known as a welcoming place, but finding that large numbers of people from outside of the community and outside of the country are being placed there, where nobody really knows what the plan is. How long are they going to stay there? Is this temporary? What type of provision is being made to support them with social services? Will there be more school places, doctors, and so on? And a lot of parts of the country outside of Dublin are quite deprived. There'd be very few, for example, general practitioner doctors available, and waiting lists for things like that. So the impact that that's having on the community hasn't been factored in. And then finally, I think the narrative, the guilt trip that the Germans and the French and the English have had to put up with because of colonialism doesn't work in Ireland to the same extent. They try a different mechanism, which is to say, well, Irish people were welcomed when they went to the United Kingdom and America and Australia and so on. And so we need to welcome the stranger to our land. And that's very easily refuted because Irish people went to, if you ever watch the movie Gangs of New York, for example, there was extreme poverty.
They were treated like largely slave labour.
Precisely that, yeah. And they were not given medical cards entitling them to free medical services. They were not given emergency accommodation. They were not fed. They were not given the kind of pocket money that's given. So what you have is none of those places that the Irish people went to in the past were welfare states. But where you have a large number of people coming into now, which is essentially a welfare state, and having access to all of the things that a welfare state offers without ever having contributed, and with a view that most people, I think, reasonably have, if you look at the figures from different European Union countries, these people are not likely to contribute, particularly not anytime soon.
It's not just economics as well. As you said, with the thick bonds of trust in homogenous communities, this isn't a community meeting another community. This is people from anywhere, no particular place, that don't even share each other's languages, that have been dropped on a community which know each other, they know each other's names. So it's not like the Irish community, which are well situated, can interact with, 500 Vietnamese people that show up and establish a Vietnamese church and establish a Vietnamese restaurant. I'm not saying that would be right, but I am saying it would be easier to at least get to know the new arrivals that have been parachuted in. These are just people, as you say, from the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, where there are inter-ethnic and tribal hostilities within their countries and between countries. They don't speak one another's languages, and so they mistrust each other and they mistrust the population that they've been inserted into. So there's no hope for integration or peace, and that's why I think the politicians know this, and so they need to stop you talking about it.
I completely agree with that. We've already seen kind of knife fights in migrant centres between different groups of migrants. So I can't say for sure whether or not that was some
tribal
dispute from the old country brought to the new country, but
that's not an Irish pastime, though. Let's put it that way.
No, it's not. Knife fights are not a pastime in Ireland, and
so certainly not over East Africa.
No, exactly that. And so, what I completely agree with you, Conor. What you have a situation is, through a variety of kind of things we could unpick about why we have this migrant influx and why it's particularly by the political left welcomed. They then realize it's deeply unpopular. And so the response to it isn't to try and control the migration in any robust way or start deportations. It's to silence the criticism.
And I think both agendas, namely the mass importation of fighting age males from incredibly different cultures with incredibly different heritages and who are likely to have certain incredibly strong tribalistic attachments to those homelands, and those are not going to grate very well with the host population. Both that agenda of sort of replacement migration and the agenda of silencing the hosts when they object to it, they do stem from a similar place, namely this idea that the human person is fundamentally a blank slate. And if you think that all human persons are blank slates and all features of their identity are chosen rather than inherited in some sense, then why can't some sub-Saharan African integrate, assimilate seamlessly into whatever Irish values are? Because you can just sort of reprogram him with Irish values, and then he becomes as Irish as you are. And likewise, the belief in the blank slate also makes you think that sort of natural host objections to this can equally be ironed out, like glitches in a software code, through robust legislation. So they both stem from a similar place.
It's not just that; it's that if the host nation objects to this, they're getting in the way of defaulting back to the blank slate, and the host nation's objections are the provocation, not the parachuting of this hostile community with tribal baggage. And I think, if I may, the reason it's worked in Britain, or at least the British population have been pacified against it, unlike the Irish patriots who are making their concerns known in the streets, is because the Irish don't have the historical cudgel hit at them like the British do with the Empire. The Irish see themselves as having been a colonised people, and they are still a people. They don't say Irish values, they say we the Irish, the Irish people. And so that means that there's a clash of civilizations here rather than a melding of one into the other.
Yeah, I think that's correct. It's one thing that strikes me, though, is the schizophrenic approach of the political elite to this whole thing. On the one hand, they're busy deconstructing what it means to have Irish values, so trying to suggest to us that our history was one of kind of control by the Catholic Church, and that the physical force tradition in Irish republicanism was illegitimate and so on. So they're trying to demolish, on this side, the values. And then on the other side, they're telling us that, well, we can simply integrate people into these values, no problem whatsoever, which I think is an extraordinary narcissism, because it suggests that the people coming in don't have any values of their own. And that rather than saying if there's a clash, maybe their values would predominate. Maybe their view of how society ought to be organised will come to the fore. And particularly in a democracy, maybe they'll start to organise themselves politically to achieve that. So I think in some ways there's no coherence to this whatsoever. It's schizophrenic, as I say, and it's a form of vandalism. And a lot of when you listen to some Irish ministers, I don't even think they're convinced at all of the merits of the proposition. I'm thinking of particularly the housing minister, Darragh O'Brien, who in the early stages of all of this, he was asked in the Parliament in the Dáil whether or not there should be a cap on numbers. And he reacted saying, oh, that's just tantamount to racism, a cap on numbers, how could you? A few months later, they were introducing a cap on numbers. Yes. So what you have to remember in Ireland, it's a small country. Dublin is the centre of the country. And within Dublin, then, there is an elite concentrated in the south of the city who are predominantly liberal in their outlook. their attitude to all of this is essentially to react with horror and shock at any suggestion of nationalism or racism. And so in rather than hearing any kind of nuanced criticism of what the government is doing, they immediately, the friend-enemy distinction kicks in, and you're a friend if you are kind of welcoming and empathetic, and you say, well, it's, you know, anyone who needs to come in, like the Minister, Darragh O'Brien, said, anyone who's fleeing Ireland will be a safe harbour for them. So conceptually, the country could be filled every square inch by that policy. That's a friend will say that kind of thing. That's a good person's attitude. Whereas somebody says, well, maybe now we need to start looking at the physical carrying capacity of the resources of the country. Well, that's dangerous. You're drifting into the territory there of nationalism. And this is absurd because it's really is the people who are most insulated from the effects of mass migration, who are this kind of liberal elite in Dublin. They have the least to lose from all of this, but they are the first to dismiss the concerns of the people who have the most to lose.
Yes.
And people are not... People are aware of this dynamic, and that's what's radicalizing Irish politics.
The luxury belief class.
The luxury belief class,
in
exactly
action.
that.
So, but there are signs there. So you think there may potentially be signs of a pushback, and you're talking about political organising here. Just broadening the discussion out a bit to free speech in general, because obviously in Ireland it's under threat, in Britain it's certainly under threat, particularly with a new Labour government, which is likely to particularly given that 5 sort of independent single-issue Gaza ticket MPs won seats at the general election. It's likely that the Labour Party the new incoming Labour government will try to bribe the Muslim community with some kind of anti-Islamophobia, hate speech laws as well. But the one question I was going to ask you is that the basic presupposition of any legal advocacy group like ADF is that the law is on your side. Once the law ceases to be on our side, what do we do?
Well, as a barrister, I mean, that's a question I often grapple with. The tool that we have as an organisation is essentially the rule of law, and so we operate at institutions and in countries where the rule of law exists. It's a necessary prerequisite for us to be able to advocate, and so I find myself in the unusual position of litigating for nearly 10 years in Strasbourg cases at the European Court of Human Rights, while also being a critic of the Human Rights Project.
Indeed, yeah.
So long as the mechanisms exist, I will use them.
Yes.
It's essentially, if one looks to Scripture, the advice from our Lord Jesus Christ was, be as wise as the serpent and as innocent as the dove. So I think what our Lord was counselling us there was to be prudential, to use mechanisms that are available to you when they present themselves, but also to be aware that the system itself may in fact increasingly become oppressive and coercive. So I will always argue for the right to free speech, because conceptually that is something that people understand. It's well established in international law, and it's easy for me to point to how it's under attack, both internationally and in this country. When you've the arrest of clients of ours for praying silently outside an abortion clinic,
yes.
When you have the arrest of other clients of ours, Dia Moodley, a street preacher in Bristol, because he offended members of the public who are Islamic, that's not a country that is living up to the human rights standard, and that's why we use that standard as a way to benchmark the activities of the police. However, at the same time, I am a critic of how these things are enforced, particularly by the European Court of Human Rights, which I think has really an incoherent approach to the protection of freedom of expression. And this makes sense in a lot of ways, because my view is that as we reach a point where the contradictions of the ideology that predominates among the political elite in Europe, as they become more apparent, and as it becomes clearer that the quality of life for the population is decreasing, our cities are becoming more dangerous and so on, the crackdown on freedom of expression is going to intensify. And we see this particularly now with the new powers that the European Union has under the Digital Services Act. They were terrified of what happened with the election of Donald Trump, of Brexit, and of the response to the migrant crisis. And so their instinctive reaction to that wasn't to try and address the concerns, but rather was to try and stop the concerns from being articulated. So censorship by the state isn't a quirk or a bug in the system. It's now the central purpose, I think, as things become worse. And frankly, the situation in France, particularly, is so volatile. I can't see any response from the state now other than to continue with the crackdown on free expression. And the same is true for Germany, unfortunately, and other European countries. So Ireland and the UK are swept up in this as well. But it has a distinctly anti-Christian flavour as well, which is kind of where my organisation's concern comes in. And the extraordinary assaults on pro-life activists and street preachers, and the attacks we've seen as well on pro-life student organisations and universities, they all show this kind of intolerance of dissent against the orthodoxy.
On that, we were recently at the ADF conference in Austria, and I put to you a question to which you responded with that particular bit of scripture concerning the ECHR. Big debate at the UK general election, now in the Tory leadership contest with Tom Tugendhat, arch avatar of the wet One Nation wing of the party, is saying he's prepared to leave the ECHR to head Nigel Farage off at the pass and take the momentum out of Reform UK. The ECHR obviously has prevented various deportation flights. It has also become the grounds for entrenching net zero into law at warp speed after an absurd lawsuit where 4 boomer women complained it was too hot to go on holiday, therefore my human rights are violated. Do we have any room for manoeuvre while staying in the ECHR, given that you've argued at Strasbourg, or do you think there are merits to the arguments that politicians have made that we need to leave it as a prerequisite to regain national sovereignty?
Membership of transnational organisations and charters like the European Convention on Human Rights are antithetical to sovereignty. They remove the decision-making legally to another place. And you can understand after the Second World War why Winston Churchill and his Attorney General at the time, Lord Kilmuir, and others felt that this was necessary to stop the advance of communism, and well-meaning people like Jean Monnet and Schuman and Adlai de Gasperi felt the same thing about the European Union, the Cold and Steel Pact and so on. So the intention was good, but like it's that idea of absolute power corrupts. I think the way to reconceptualize it, power attracts the corruptible. These large institutions, like moths to a flame, draw in a type of person who derives enormous satisfaction from interfering in the lives of millions, tens of millions of people. And that has been, I'm prepared to defend that position with numerous examples over my time in Strasbourg at an international institution. They want to have a situation where the state can interfere in the family, in the education of children, in what you can say, how you can express it, how you can organize church organizations, a whole range of things that the state has no business interfering with. That these conventions and these human rights bodies were set up to restrain state power have now been weaponized by the type of person who is attracted to these international institutions, weaponized against the little battalions of family, of school, of community. And they've made it, you're correct, the assessments of the European Court of Human Rights in cases like FG in Sweden have made it impossible to control mass migration. Things like the Refugee Convention and so on, the 1951 Convention, they made sense in an era where you were dealing with a trickle of political dissidents coming across the Iron Curtain.
And they were landlocked.
And they were landlocked. And they were from a similar cultural background. That's no longer the case, but you're still required, as far as the judges in Strasbourg are concerned, to make individual assessments of everybody's claim and not and stick to a standard that they've set out in a series of cases, which even administratively, when you have millions of people coming into the continent, is impossible to comply with. So long as we remain members of these institutions, we will not have sovereignty.
Yes.
And they will never stop, because the type of people who go into those institutions are on a messianic power trip.
And
Not all of them, I would say, but a lot of people in those institutions are on a messianic power trip.
And there's a very difficult to get around post-war sentimentality, which keeps these institutions and indeed their founding charters and their rules and their
Yes.
architecture on life support as well, even though events are proving that they've been outmoded. The other thing I wanted to raise with you, Lorcan, is that it's interesting because on the one hand we're talking about an extreme state of laxity, an extreme state of permissiveness that exists in society, and on the other hand we're talking about society becoming more and more clamped down, more and more censorious, and there was a good term for this coined in the 1990s by a sort of a dissident right-wing conservative writer called Sam Francis, anarcho-tyranny, where you get a certain amount of anarchy and a certain amount of tyranny coexisting alongside each other, and it's very puzzling from a sort of commonsensical point of view. How is this happening? I think it goes back again to the ideological mission that the people we're talking about are on. You need to be fundamentally ideological about things in order to impose anarcho-tyranny on your population. And so a good example of this would be to go back again to the sort of the blank slate view of human nature, which informs all of this ideological activism. There's this belief that human beings and anything that's undesirable in society, like high crime rates or differential, let's take differential crime rates between different communities. Okay, the blank slate dictates that there can't be anything sort of natural going on there. There can't be anything. That's not a reflection of a sort of the fallenness of human nature. That is the net result of all sorts of systemic inequalities existing in our society. And therefore, let's say that you get a sort of a serial black recidivist. It is unthinkable for someone who accepts those ideological priors to prosecute him again, because then all you're doing is compounding his impression. So differential crime rates between communities might be a regrettable symptom of an unjust society, but the intolerable cause of that unjust society are your opinions, the fact that you notice things. And so that's what needs to be ironed out, and that's where you get the tyrannical end of anarcho-tyranny, and you also get a sort of permissiveness about crime going on at the same time. You would agree that would you think that we live under a state of anarcho-tyranny?
I certainly think we do, and I would agree with that analysis. I would add to it that the mounting contradictions and the absurdities of the various policies that the elite have fashionably kind of implemented, particularly since the 1960s, are now they're so manifestly harmful for social cohesion and for human flourishing that the only way to hold it all together is force. And so you have this ever-escalating force response. And I don't simply mean physical force, I mean as well, like more institutions and more powers. So the collapse of the family, for example, by high rates of divorce and so on, and a failure for marriage. The state comes in then. It creates the conditions that allow that to happen. And then the response to this is, well, we simply need more social workers and we need more money to fund more programs and so on to offset the harm caused by the permissive attitude. So it's the perfect dialectic because if you think again, the type of people that are attracted to mediating these or running these structures and apportioning the funds and the financing of all these various programs, they believe that what they're doing is fundamentally good and for the better. I often think of it as conservatives regard the administrative state and politics as a distasteful reality that you need to dip in and out of every so often to keep the show running. Whereas these type of people I'm talking about, they see it as their religion. They worship in these institutions. You know, it's our sacred democracy, our sacred European Court of Human Rights, and so on. And so the kind of zeal that they have to constantly reach ever deeper into every element of society in response to the very problems that they create through their various fever dream policies, that's never going to end.
Is their instrument of returning to Eden?
Well, of course, this is a fallen world, as Christians believe. The key thing is to establish a relationship with Jesus Christ. I'm a Catholic sacramentally through the church, I would say, and to recognize that any utopian projects are bound to fail in a fallen world.
This is why I keep raising the blank slate. What we're up against is a sort of Rousseauian poison, which denies the fundamental fact that we are fallen creatures, and therefore there are just certain aspects that just disciplines what we can achieve politically. And this conservative approach is to acknowledge that fallen condition, to acknowledge the boundaries that imposes upon all sort of ideological ambition, and to work with human nature. So, for example, there would be an acknowledgement that tribalism, whatever you think about it, is just an inescapable feature of the human condition. And so, in a society where when you're trying to set up a thriving society, it's not going to be perfect, but if you want to set up a maximally thriving society, an acknowledgement of that fact needs to be made, and that just limits certain things that you're able to do.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, you mentioned by reference to the Enlightenment and Rousseau. I think one of the most pernicious ideas that I have ever encountered is this notion that man is born free and yet everywhere in chains. That's complete nonsense. People aren't born tabula rasa, blank slate. They're born into a thick, or they ought to be, a series of relationships, family, community, and then more widely to your nation.
Yes.
And those things should not be seen as chains or restrictions, but rather as what it means to be civilized, being part of a fabric bigger than yourself. And for the religious person, that is totally ordained in Scripture, the notion of nations and family, and it's at the heart of really what we believe. And I think it's necessary, again, for human flourishing, for a stable society to exist. Having those things stripped away, it leaves you, individual, and then the monolith of the state. And they want an entirely vertical relationship between you rather than these horizontal relationships you ought to have with family and community.
I've said this before. Once the predominant relationship that exists in society is that between the individual and the state, with all those sorts of intermediary civilizing structures hollowed out, you're really left with just two options. Either you can trust the individual to be good on his own, or you can make him good through law.
Yeah.
And neither of those are particularly plausible options. There is a third option, which is indifference to how people behave. But as far as I'm aware, no thriving civilization.
I don't think you can have a civilization
ever
been
founded on that basis.
I'm not suggesting that all of these institutions are full of Leninists, but they do see themselves in that kind of way of engineers of the human soul.
Exactly.
And they believe they will make you good in their image.
Yes.
And they'll do that through a variety of programs and a whole cadre, an army of social workers and psychologists and human rights lawyers.
Indeed.
And all of these things then will ever escalate as a response to the chaos that they also create.
But what they produce through that is just a series of homeless drug addicts. I mean, I wrote for this exact topic for the European Conservative, which you edited after visiting America and seeing the kind of UN AIDS principles policies they want to put on all member nations about the decriminalization of drugs and abortion at all terms and of transgenderism and of sleeping rough. And I saw this play out with a bunch of heroin addicts sleeping in dilapidated shop windows because they've decriminalized looting in Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
And those people are maximally free. They're not bound by a congregation.
They've
or a family.
self-actualized completely.
Yeah, they're totally at liberty to live in a tent city in the middle of your street, and you complaining about it gets you locked up. And you're precisely right. That interaction between just the individual and the state, the individual also has options on how they interact with the state. They can either be naked and afraid in the face of state tyranny and submit to this ideology that the state is promulgating out of fear, or they can do the thing that we saw in Maccabees, which is essentially hold tight to Scripture and be a martyr and refuse to renounce your principles at the expense possibly of your life. And that seems to be the position we're in.
Yeah, putting it fairly bluntly, I do think, and I've said this before to different groups, that as a Christian, particularly in a society that becomes increasingly hostile to that witness, you will have to imagine for yourself not just the social costs of losing friends, which people will react to, and family criticism, but also professional costs of losing your job and so on, but even now losing your liberty. Possibly if you have something like conversion therapy introduced in this country, which strikes at the heart of the right of parents to be able to raise their children. It strikes at the heart of the pastoral relationship between a pastor, a priest, and a penitent. It says essentially in the early drafts I've seen that any kind of coercion, obviously I disagree with physical coercion of any kind because it's just counterproductive anyway, but trying to suggest to somebody, your sexual orientation is not your identity, and that if you want to have a closer relationship with Christ, you need to understand that Scripture has a certain view of how you ought to live a godly life, and that is the way to salvation. If that's been criminalized as a conversion therapy, then you will have a situation where pastors and others in the Christian community will have to make a decision of whether or not they're prepared to go to jail for that. Because if you care about your fellow human beings, your fellow man, you want to see them saved. You want to see them in the streets of glory. And that means you will be acting in a manner directly contrary to the new orthodoxy. And so what are you prepared to do in order to bear authentic witness to Jesus Christ and to want the better of your fellow man? And I think we will see Christians jailed. We already have seen Christians arrested and detained and prosecuted
and
for
stabbed
praying.
In the case of Pantash.
Exactly that, yes. So, well, I'm not even talking about intercommunal violence, which is a real problem in the future.
This is
the state on individual, which has already started. And I'm shocked as well to see that the new government in this country now is proposing to, under the guidelines around the new Public Order Act, criminalise silent prayer and prayer for witness near abortion clinics. So that for a lot of Christians, they feel that God has put it on their hearts to pray near abortion clinics for the lives of the unborn children and for the women to change their minds. The fact that that now becomes a criminal offence is outrageous, and yet that's happening now. And you can see very much in that direction of travel the possibility of all sorts of other totally otherwise normal, non-coercive, non-violent interactions between Christians and their family and friends and others being criminalised under conversion therapy laws and other speech laws. So the tyranny element of the anarcho is certainly, it's not just theoretical. I think it's very much with us.
The human condition is not an engineering problem. The sooner we realise that, the sooner we may escape anarcho-tyranny and find our way back into ordered freedom. Listen, Lorcan, Price, thank you so much for joining us on Deprogrammed this week. Connor, thank you as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.